This week on the podcast, we are joined by former Royal Marine Commando turned outdoor brand photographer and expedition guide Ian Finch. Ian has been traveling to remote environments for over 10 years now and has some hardcore trips, including a 2,000-mile canoe descent down the Yukon River in Alaska. While there, he met some of the locals and natives, and he captured it in his photography. We also chat about his 1,300-mile journey retracing the footsteps of the Cherokee's removal in the Trail of Tears, as well as his journey into becoming an outdoor brand photographer. Enjoy this week's discussion with Mr. Finch.
Salut.
你好
E aí, galera?
Bem-vindo ao Travel Tribe.
欢迎来到 Travel Tribe。
Bem-vindo ao Travel Tribe.
Bienvenue au podcast de Triple Trip.
Welcome to the Travel Tribe podcast. So a 2,000-mile canoe descent down the Yukon River in Alaska. Where did you get the inspiration for this trip?
Yeah, it's twofold, really. That I had my sort of like upbringing to sort of thank for it, and or as even a catalyst for it, and then my love of outdoors and adventure. So the family side of it was I grew up in a household where my father was very much interested in sort of Indigenous history. And all manner of things like that, and photography and those side of things. So I grew up with that sort of bubbling under the surface. And then there was my love of adventure and being outdoors. And the Yukon, the trip, really, for the idea for it, the expedition came from me really just looking at a map and think, right, I want to go away for a long period of time, like 2-3 months. I would love to canoe a river. So at that point, I'd had very limited experience canoeing, but I'd fallen in love with the idea of canoeing. And also going in search of a much longer trip that I could interview and speak to people over a long sort of period of time and really get to the nuts and bolts of who the people were that lived along the side of the river. So I had a few places in mind in Canada, but when I looked at the map and then I looked at the length of the Yukon, then I sort of started to really look into the history of the Yukon and the people that arrived in that area and now lived there. There was a lot of moving parts, a lot of interests there. So I decided to canoe the length of that river and put together a couple of people to join me, a photographer and a long distance paddlist and a filmmaker. Yeah, and I just really sort of sat and thought about it for a while, and then thought, right, this is gonna be the one. And I sort of went about preparing for it, saving, planning, and quitting the jobs that I had at the time to go on the trip, which was a bit of a crazy move, but it paid off in the end. But yeah, it was well worth it.
Yeah. Speaking of preparation for such a quite long journey and adventure, what was your preparation like? What did you need to bring with you? How much money did you need to save up? And what time frame were you planning for this adventure?
So the time frame was anything within that 3-month period, because being from the UK, that's all I can spend in the US. Even though actually the first part of the trip we were in Canada and then crossing the border into Alaska. So the preparation took about a year and a bit, and that was thinking about how much food we were going to need, and actually putting the food or separating the food and put it into these big canoe barrels that you paddle with you, which is quite common for long distance expeditions in canoes. You have these big blue bear-proof barrels, and they have various food within each barrel and equipment within each barrel. So we had to work out exactly what was going to be in each barrel, how we were going to post it. Also then thinking about getting everybody involved, getting them into the country, out of the country, because 2 of them were from Canada. Also, we had no money to pay any of these people. So the other 3 people didn't get paid either. I kind of had to use my enthusiasm and passion for the story to kind of sell that to them. And one of the guys, the photographer, who is pretty well-renowned photographer, and he's even more well-renowned now, an amazing guy. I'd been following him for a few years, so for me to bring him on board was really tough. So I said, could he fly in at certain points and capture the story? Because I had no magazine deal at anything at this point. There was nothing. I just wanted some pictures of the trip, and he was a photographer that I admired for years. And he said, look, it's too expensive for me to come into Alaska or fly into Alaska at certain points of the trip. How about I just come along for the whole journey and work with you on the narrative and the story and the imagery, and then we'll see what we can do afterwards. So that was mind blowing to have him. But I hadn't had a huge amount of experience canoeing at that point, so I paddled a couple of UK rivers and water systems, and then we went over there and purchased the canoe. So I pre-purchased the canoes before we went over. Pre-purchased a lot of equipment. So where we were flying, we actually got to the point probably 2 or 3 days into the actual, from the source of the river, picked up all the equipment, and then we flew into the source on one of those tiny little float planes that then just dropped us off, and then we continued to paddle the whole distance. So, I mean, there was a huge amount of preparation, but that can only get you so far. Once you're actually on the river or the lake systems, which the Yukon is at the beginning, you just have to kind of just roll with it, really, and be super flexible and be mindful of conditions. But yeah, we had some creative preparation. So the filmmaker and get an idea of what we wanted to film from the photography standpoint, what I was going to write about. But other than that, a lot of it was just adapting to the trip as and when it happened.
Mm-hmm. And you say you kind of work in this space with people pushing to their limits and yourself. Were there kind of any fears you had before going on this adventure? And if so, how did you overcome them?
I think the fears were probably being out of my depth from a canoeing sense, because it's a very, very, very fast river and there's some big lake systems that people have died on in quite a few circumstances. So yeah, those were my fears. That we wouldn't get to the end, that was a fear, because I really wanted to do that and I really wanted everybody to be together. I guess I was concerned about the human relationships of how people would get on for that period of time, considering none of us had ever met. There's a few little small things, but you mitigate that with just good preparation, good communication, good preparation, and then when you're on the trips, you try your best to keep that that good communication going, which at times was really hard because you've got people and you've got slightly different outcomes and expectations, different personality types. So those kind of things can be quite challenging. But ultimately, if you're all on the same page in terms of, right, we're going to get to the end and we want to do this together and create a body of work together and a great memory and a great trip together, then you can kind of overcome those things.
Yeah, I can relate to. I did a trip. We planned a motorcycle trip, and from north of Vietnam to south of Vietnam, from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City. And I remember looking at the itinerary, and I said, my friend was planning. I'm like, "There's no way we're going to make this amount of motorcycling we need to do every day." And I know the feeling of making. We made it halfway to the country to Hoi An, and we had to sell our motorbikes and fly the rest of the way. So I know what the feeling is like when you don't finish all the way. But what was the day-to-day like when you guys were on the canoe? What did it look like?
So you get into you might have felt the same when you was actually on your motorcycle trip. You get into like a rhythm, and that rhythm is all down to routine. And you probably wake up roughly around the same time. You have people that probably make breakfast and do certain things. The canoes were in a certain position because we had to sleep on islands pretty much for most of the trip, because the grizzly bears patrol the side of the river, and where the river freezes over in winter, it kind of carves these islands there's thousands of them down on the river. They're every kind of like 6, 7, 8 miles or something like that, and these islands have big sandy beaches and then little mini forests at the back. So you'd wake up, you'd have your breakfast, you'd pretty much all the time, morning, afternoon and evening, we would have fires. So we got into the habit of actually being pretty good at starting fires, even in like quite terrible conditions. We would only use the gas stoves when it was really heavy rain and that kind of stuff. So it was fires 3 times a day. Mm-hmm. And then you'd kind of like paddle till probably 2 o'clock, 2 o'clock, something like that. But you'd keep the canoes together at all times, and try and paddle together as much as you can. And then in the evenings, it would be the reverse. You would just paddle to a certain time. You'd then, the next island that you come to, if it was suitable enough, and there was enough driftwood there that we could make fires, you'd just put the canoes, the food and the fire at the kind of front of the island. And then you'd put your tents way back towards the back, because if any grizzly bears swim across the river or any moose come across the river, they'd be drawn to the canoes and the food and everything. They wouldn't be drawn to your tents. So the only kind of things we would have in our tents would be just your sleeping bag, your sleeping mat, a book, maybe a pen and paper, that kind of thing. And you do that. We did that for kind of, I think it was like 68 days we were paddling, and then in between that, every week or so, we would arrive into a native community, and then introduce ourselves respectfully to the chief or any people that are in that community, and let them know what we were there for, what we were kind of the story that we were telling. And then we would sometimes sleep on the floor of a church or on the floor of someone's house, or under these kind of little recreational areas that are beside the river that some of the little native children play in. But most of it was on these islands in the middle of the river, every night.
Mm-hmm. And what was your reception by some of these native people there? Were they excited to take part in your project and open up to you, or what was the reception like, and what were those experiences like?
Yeah, most of the experiences were amazing. Like really very welcoming, very interested, very sort of inclusive and wanting to help us. And the funny thing is that they would call us river rats, and they would know that from community to community, which are sometimes 30, 40, 50 miles apart, they would communicate, and they knew of your arrival before that you were coming. So I think if you were troublesome or as we say in England, a pain in the arse, they would be expecting that. But what we did was, every time we had this kind of system of myself and Caroline, who was the filmmaker, we would go and see the chief or go and see someone who was in a position of authority, and just let them know why we were there, where if there was anywhere we could camp respectfully to the community, the story we were kind of there to tell, and if there was anybody that we could talk to, interview, photograph, or anything like that, that feels they had something positive to share, or something interesting, or something about the traditions or culture or how things are changing, and etc., to let us know. But I mean, there were times when we had to be quite careful with that, because on previous years, journalists and stuff like that had come into the community like we had by a canoe, and promised that they were going to recontact them in a year and show them the film, and they would spend hours, sometimes days, with some of these native communities, and that would be the last they heard of them. So we would actually have to go in there and just let them know that we're there for the right reasons, and we wanted to build rapport and just be open to communicating with them. But 9 times out of 10, it was like really incredible sort of reception that we had, and some of the help that we received was just unbelievable. People giving us food and giving us food to take with us, inviting us into their homes, taking us fishing, taking us out on boats to teach us about their connection to the river and fishing and everything like that. So they didn't have to do that, and they did, and it really transformed the trip for us. It was incredible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Are there any specific examples that kind of stand out for you that maybe your kind of mind was blown, where you saw something completely, different, or you viewed something completely different during these encounters?
Yeah, there was 2 people that really, really stick in my mind, and there were people that I wrote to afterwards when we got home and we'd finished everything. I wrote to them and sent some pictures that we had to say thank you and everything like that. And one of them was a lady called Julie, who is she was incredible, and she was just teaching us about the animals and when the animals come and go and the connection to the wildlife that the native people still have. And then she was talking about mining and some of the mining that's impacting the water quality and et cetera, in some of these communities. And she was teaching us these tiny, tiny outdoor clues and signs to recognize in the area that when certain animals would arrive and all of those kind of things. And she was like an earth mother, like a very spiritual woman. And she was just somebody that stood out to me. But I think one of the other people that really stood out was a guy called Walter. And he was a native guy, and he had grown up in this one community. And he met us on this little beach that we paddled up to, and he came down on a quad and introduced himself. And then he became our friend for like 2 or 3 days. And he had an incredible story of, he had issues with drink, and then he went into he moved from his native community into Fairbanks, I think it was. He flew into Fairbanks, and I think he went to school there or got a job there, and he had I think alcohol and some issues with substances and that kind of stuff. And he kind of, to get himself out of that situation, he flew back into his community to help out again and remove himself from that sort of environment. Mm-hmm. And he's just, he took us to his smoke houses where they smoke all of the salmon, and he told us all about his life, and was very open and very vulnerable about his lifestyle, and how he's changed and how he's trying to help people in the community and build up certain traditions to do with the fish and the salmon and smoking. And he was just an incredible guy, and so friendly and so open and so warm. And you remember stuff like that. And that's one of the big takeaways from that trip, was the generosity of some of the native people that we met in the communities.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to kind of storytelling, did this kind of keep molding as you went along, or what's your process like when it comes to storytelling?
I think you have you have a narrative before you go. You have an idea of what it's going to be like, and then you have some key pointers of some of the things you really want to work on, and some of the questions that you want to ask, or subject matters that you want to approach. But sometimes that shifts. When actually on these trips, sometimes it does shift. I think you've got to stay flexible with when it comes to the story. You've got to have that key thread, but you just stay flexible. And if anything comes up, you can film that and talk to people about a certain subject. But you kind of have that nucleus of an idea, and you can kind of just work within that, and try not to like kind of poo-poo anything. If anyone wants to talk about something, or something comes up, you can just sit there and talk about it. And the key idea of that trip was to talk about the people's connection to the river and what the river meant to the people. Mm-hmm. And that was something that we came up, that every interview and every conversation that we had was, what does the river mean to you? What's changing? What's improving? So that was always there. But if we had other conversations, which we did, about music and about traditions and heritage and about my life, they were asking questions about us, like why do you want to learn about us, and why do you want to know about the connection to the river? So you kind of have to be open to exploring lots of different avenues. That then, once you get to the point of producing the piece, whether it's written, photographic, or film, there's lots of ways you can go in, and one thing I find about all trips is that you go into it with an idea, but then you come out not only with a different idea but a different person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we did a podcast last week with the travel writer, and I was just talking about the same thing, how I feel whenever I do a long trip, especially when I have experiences that are completely new and foreign, and where I've pushed my boundaries, like that motorcycle trip in Vietnam that always stands out. That you come back with, you feel like you kind of shed a skin, and you come back as a new person, new perspective, new way of looking at things. Like, I don't know, it's almost like you come back a brand new character than the person you left behind. You're like, oh, that was such an obsolete version of myself. Now I have this new experience and new way of looking at my life. Right. Mm. So, regarding these communities, are they mostly kind of isolated and self-sustaining, or are they kind of still connected with kind of the rest of society and connected via social media and internet?
Yeah. They're kind of westernized as far as internet goes and all of that kind of stuff. They have, some of them, a majority of them don't have roads because they're just in far kind of northwest Alaska. But they all have airports, these mini airports, and the mail and medical supplies and stuff gets flown in and flown out, which is incredibly expensive. But yeah, the job situation there, I think, is pretty tough, and life is pretty tough there, and it's quite difficult for me to sort of comment on it in depth, because I was only there for a certain amount of days, and it's a much more complex story and issue that goes far beyond my sort of opinions and stuff like that. What I found is that it was some of the people that we met are some of the kindest and nicest and most generous and open people that you can meet. And I think what means a lot to them and to us is the act of sharing. and share. And that's one thing I took away from all of these trips is generosity and sharing to people, and obviously giving your time. They gave so much time to us, so they shared so much with us, not only food but knowledge, wisdom, care. So yeah, it's their life is hard there, especially in winter. I mean, in the Yukon, it goes down to -50, so life is very, very, very tough, and the opportunities are limited, but they're very close knit.
Yeah, relating kind of back to my Vietnam motorcycle trip as well, I remember one of the biggest takeaways I had from that trip was when we were riding these motorcycles, which we thought were Hondas, but were actually fake cheap Chinese motorcycles that were breaking down and, squirting gasoline everywhere. And they'd break down along the road, and we were in the middle of nowhere. And these Vietnamese repair shops would, like, for example, fix our tire, and they could have charged us anything. They could have, we had nowhere to go. There's no one in sight. There was no Uber to call. You're in the middle of nowhere. And yet, they seemed like a fair price. Fixed all our motorcycles, really excited to meet us. And comparing that to the experiences you have in like the big cities, like, Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi, you're kind of viewed as a dollar sign. And I think it's just because when you have these big cities, you have all these people fighting for these limited resources of money. And so that kind of takes away this human aspect of it. Like when you're describing these people in the communities, there's so much generosity and sharing. And I feel that's such a key element of our human nature until we're kind of put into these big cities to fight for these resources, where we kind of start losing that. So it's positive and optimistic to hear these stories that you were mentioning. Were there any other values that you noticed that were very different from, let's say, your own that kind of really stood out?
Any values?
Like, for example, one thing you mentioned was their deep connection and the importance of rivers and nature. Is there anything else that kind of stood out to you that you noticed, like, that kind of, I don't know, maybe made an impression on you?
Yeah, I would say reinforced is a good word. Reinforced and stood out was the importance of what nature means to people, I think, and how important it is to protect what is there. And one of the things that I had read briefly before going on the trip and then understood to some detail afterwards was the fact that the indigenous communities are historically so connected to the landscape in so many more ways than wildlife, and there were so many things that we spoke about with people about, especially as one example in Greenland when I was there, there wasn't many words for hunting. It was more of a harvest. You go to harvest animals on the wildlife, so you would harvest in a respectful way, and therefore it comes back the following year, and you don't take the animals. The actual animals give themselves to you. So I think there was this beautiful sort of important connection that I learnt about, and that was reinforced by going on these trips, about how we should protect what we have, how important nature is to not only our physical being but our mental health, and the health of the planet, to protect these places. But there was a lot of pain that we heard about and spoke about, because the king salmon that are actually in the Yukon River, the sizes of the salmon, the quality of the salmon are in decline because of sort of various factors, but one of them is overfishing out in the Bering Sea and out the mouth of the river. So certain fish can't make it all the way up the river into the spawning grounds. So therefore, the wildlife fish and game are kind of monitoring and slowing down the access to the fish on the river, saying that you can take this fish, you can't take this fish, when historically, obviously, the indigenous communities would take what they needed and never more than what they needed. So now there's a restriction on that. So there's this kind of awareness that I found it even being in the UK or going on trips abroad, is that we go into nature for a purpose. We go in for recreation, we go in for sort of like connection, and we go to push ourselves, and we go into it for a reason. Whereas I think the indigenous view is we are part of it. It is a sort of all encompassing, all one. We don't go into it for a reason. And that view completely like shifted now, sort of when I love woodlands and I love forests. So now I'm kind of looking at the grander scale of what the forest ecosystem is. and what it means, rather than going into it for a hike or a walk or a camp or something like that. It just speaking to these people and hearing these views and looking at the greater sort of field of connection, these trips, that's what it really brings home. And like you said, it changes you change as a person. Your consciousness expands, and you're not thinking about where you live and just around where you live or your country. You're thinking more on a global scale.
Yeah. I've personally, after the pandemic, I've always enjoyed going on hikes and being outdoors, but I don't think I've ever felt such a longing for or a necessity to be out in nature until the pandemic happened. And I really am aware that nowadays, when, whether I go hiking in the mountains or I was just recently in the seaside in the Baltic Sea, I was actually jumping in the frigid waters. It's you feel this energy that kind of recharges you. And it kind of, I feel like this kind of recharge every time I'm in nature. And what are some of the kind of differences or benefits of doing a longer expedition trip versus just going like on a weekend camping trip? Were there anything that you noticed that was kind of like significantly valuable by doing a longer expedition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when you do a shorter trip, it's more of like a short, sharp dose of nature, and the longer expeditions, I found myself remembering memories that I hadn't thought of in 20 years. And when you're paddling for 8 hours a day, there is not a huge amount to think about. When you're paddling down that river, I mean, you're seeing the wildlife, you may see another couple of canoeists, and the girl that I was paddling with, she was French Canadian, so she was teaching me French, but there's only so much of that you can do. So you do go into your mind quietens so much when you do some of these bigger trips. Even I would say even a week or something like that, or a couple of weeks. If there was a trip like that, you'd have the same feeling of being much more connected to where you are, like the temperament of where you are, the kind of like slowing down. I think a lot of us in cities, everything is so fast paced. There's this rhythm and rush, and there's the constant bombardment of phone messages, emails, expectations. But when you're out there, it's kind of like, right, today we have a goal to paddle 30 miles or 40 miles. We need to wake up, we need to paddle, we need to eat lunch, we need to paddle, and then we're around the fire again in that evening. And that there's a beautiful simplicity to that. And that simplicity, you learn to be happy with what you've got. You learn to be happy with this kind of simple goal every day of getting from A to B. And that was one thing I took away from these trips, is when I came home, I walked into my room again, or my house again, and I was like, holy shit, I don't need half of the stuff in this house. Or when I go camping now, I think I don't need hardly anything. I'm out for 3 or 4 days. That's going to be a beautiful tonic, a beautiful dose of simplicity in my tent, in the weather. That's what these trips teach you. They teach you simplicity and connection and slowing down. And I think when you slow down, you're outside, the bubble bursts of this kind of Western fast-paced culture that we live in, and it allows things to just seep back in again. And I think that the longer expeditions, it shifts you and it changes the fabric of who you are, and that's why you find a lot of people that do the big through hikes like PCT, AT, the Continental Divide Trail. They go on to the next one the next year, or sometimes do it in reverse, because they're always looking for the simplicity and the A to B of each day, and the lack of complication, and the lack of having responsibility. I think having all these crazy responsibilities in life of expectations. Yeah, so there's always a part of me that wants to go back on the next trip, the next 3-month trip, to see what evolves from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Our last guest actually had done, all three of those hiked the AT, PCT. He had done one 4 times back. He's got some record for doing, I think, 4 times back and forth.
Oh, wow.
And he was kind of discussing that as well, the addictive nature of it. Had started a business and all these things, but he said that he got the most clarity out of those hikes. And then he realized that no matter how much money you had, that's exactly what he'd be doing. So he decided to kind of downgrade on his, working and corporate life. But regarding living in nature, I had spent some time, about half a year, living on an island and working as a scuba diving instructor. And one of the things I noticed is also spending a significant amount of time is that it takes a couple of days, but then I adjust to the sync and symmetry of nature. Like I'm waking up with the sunrise. I'm very in tune with how the weather is. I'm watching the sunset go down every night. And I feel very connected to nature, and of course, scuba diving, you're with marine life, and so I feel like there's this shift that occurs as well, where I feel extremely connected, and it's something that when you were mentioning how you look back on these times, that they kind of stands out in your mind. That is one thing that kind of always stands out in my mind as well. Was this time period of living on this island for so many months, it's something that it's really hard to replicate when living in the city with the fast pace. And I always kind of daydream sometimes of back to that time period. Regarding also some of your expeditions, were there any kind of is there any kind of like advice or takeaways you would give for people who are, for example, living this fast-paced lifestyle that would like to slow down or spend more time in the outdoors?
Yeah, I would say start locally first. Like try. There's so many health benefits to just going for a simple walk. Go in, especially in a woodland, and being near a woodland, or if you can. Not a lot of people have access to woodlands and green spaces, so finding a green space and hiking in it. Sorry, can you just repeat the question again?
Yeah, so I was wondering, like, if someone, for example, is kind of tied down, living this fast-paced lifestyle, anything you'd recommend for them to kind of take a step towards becoming more, slowing down or getting more in tune with nature, or seeing some of these benefits that you're getting from your trips that they could also kind of implement? Yeah,
I think the first thing that springs to mind is camping. Is spending a night out. I think an adventure becomes an adventure when like you can go for a beautiful hike in an incredible woodland and receive the amazing benefits of that. I think walking while being silent is a real interesting thing. Listening to the bird song, listening to the wind in the trees, observing, slowing down, not trying to rush through the route. But I think a 1 or 2 day trip is really special because you get to feel what the actual elements are like, and how the elements influence what you do and that kind of thing, and how elements fluctuate, especially like wind and rain and all those kind of things. When you're out in and you go and you stay in a tent, be it on a campsite or be it anywhere, you get to see how small we are because of the elements. And how small you feel, and how much respect that you get for the elements by spending a night out, and then actually waking up, if possible, with the sun, and then or moving from one location to another, like A to B location, having like a 10K walk one day or a 15K, and having that distance, moving from A to B with a camp in between. That's a great way to really get a sense of like achievement and moving through a landscape. I think that's a real beautiful thing. But people, you don't have to do that if people, there's companies out there that can help you achieve those kind of things and guide you through those experiences. But for the average person to get that, you can just go on a lovely walk, I would say, through a forest or a woodland for an afternoon and just sit there and have lunch in that woodland with a couple of friends. I mean, that's a beautiful thing. Right, exactly. And I think you mentioned state parks and national parks earlier. I think that's also a great resource that you don't have to go too far away. You hopefully don't have to go too far away from to kind of take advantage of as well. One thing I was kind of curious of regarding your adventures, did you have any kind of close encounters, any kind of close calls, any near-death experiences during your time out there? Yeah, I mean, there's been a few things. In Alaska, there was lots of grizzlies out there, and you kind of you're managing those experiences, bearing in mind you're in their environment, so you're respecting their environment, and you have kind of procedures that you go through every night, so you don't have any problems with grizzlies. We got charged by a moose one time on an island on the Yukon, but one of the situations which I've probably come close to drowning was we were on the Mississippi. So myself and a friend had hiked across. We were following an old Native American trail, which was the Trail of Tears, which is the Cherokee were forced from the ancestral homelands in the 1800s from the Great Smoky Mountains, and moved on foot or by boat into Indian Territory, which is modern day sort of Oklahoma, and lots of Cherokee people sadly died on that journey. There's quite a few thousand. And it was called the Trail of Tears because of the excess deaths that happened on that, which was just terrible. So we decided to follow this route and share the story. And this was in 2019. So we crossed the Great Smoky Mountains on foot, and then we canoed the Tennessee River, which goes north in Kentucky and Alabama and Tennessee, and then it hits the Ohio River in Kentucky, and then the Ohio meets the Mississippi, and then we paddled down to Memphis, and then walked on foot to Oklahoma. So it was about 1,300 miles in total, all of those three sort of components. But one of the times on the Mississippi, so we were kind of in tornado season on the Mississippi. So there was lots of like volatile weather, lots of volatile winds, crazy storm systems. But one of the major problems was the boat traffic on the Mississippi. So the Mississippi, I don't know if you've crossed it on a bridge or you've seen the Mississippi itself, but there's lots of these huge barges, and they push these huge metal containers all the way up the river. And each day when we got onto the Mississippi, these huge containers, which were pushing, 12 to 15 huge metal containers of cement and all various sort of resources up and down the river, they would create these huge wakes in the river. So being in a canoe in a huge wake is not the best thing. So whenever we'd see one of these coming, we'd have to pull the canoe over onto the side of the river, which was sometimes impossible. So we'd actually have to paddle into forests that were flooded and hold onto a tree, and then these huge wakes would come through and everything. So there was one day where there was a really bad weather front coming in, and there was tornado threats and lightning threats and all of these different things. So we pulled over at lunchtime, and it was about 2 miles shy of our intended location, which was on the bend of a river, the big part of the Mississippi, and it was this kind of barge congregation point where they get refueled and mechanics work on them and everything. And the water was too dangerous for us to paddle on. So we had pulled over, we'd had lunch, and then we were thinking, at this place, there's going to be warm, there's going to be shelter, there's going to be pizza, there's going to be all of these things. And we're sitting there in the mud on the side of the river in this kind of overgrown swampy area. And we were kind of like, if we can just paddle, there's going to be a lot of rain, there's going to be a lot of wind. If we can just paddle and get there and just rough it for an hour or two, it's going to be a lot better in the long run. And this is the things that I find on some of these big expeditions. There's moments of decision which you choose, which are like pretty much make or break decisions. Like for a climber, you go for the summit when the weather window's tight, or you make these decisions in challenging moments. And this was one of ours. So we decided to paddle back out onto the river. And because all of these, we were moving into this area where all these shipping containers and all of these barges were parked, they park them on the side of the river, or they tie them to the bank on the side of the river. Now, because the Mississippi and the Ohio at this point were flooded, and this was in late March, kind of early April 2019, so that had lots of meltwater and rains in the upper Mississippi. This had all washed down, and it had flooded the whole of the Mississippi. So the banks of the Mississippi the water was in forests now, so we were paddling through forests, and which changed the nature of the river, which made it really, really dangerous, which we got told a bit later on that we were absolute lunatics to paddle on the river, but we had to do what we had to do. So we made the decision to paddle out, but to save going out into the centre of the river where it was really rough and these barges were still moving up and down, we decided to paddle between the bank of the river and this huge line of barges, which were only 10 feet out from the bank. And there was this little tiny channel that we could paddle down safely. right down the side of the bank, and we weren't being impacted by any swell or any danger or anything like that, which we thought at the time. So every 4 containers, there was a huge gap of maybe 100 feet, and there was eddies in these gaps. So an eddy, for those that don't know, is like a reversing section of water where water reverses on itself, and it creates almost like a stagnant area of water where you can rest. So kayakers, paddlers, all those kind of things can rest in these areas, which usually appear on the sides of rivers and stuff. So every couple of 100 meters, we were stopping in these little eddies and chilling, watching this weather system that was coming in, which was absolutely horrific. It looked like a tornado. And we were thinking, right, we just got to keep going. And at this point, the rain was just it was biblical amounts of rain. So we were like, we've just got to get there. So we kept paddling down this river, and then we pulled into this another massive open section between these big sections of containers. And then we got our cameras out to photograph this oncoming weather system, which was, it was literally like a tornado. But then when I looked up, I realized that we weren't actually in an eddy. It was actually still part of the current of this really strong current of the Mississippi. So at this point, the Ohio and the Mississippis converge. And it's on a bend. So you've got 2 super powerful bodies of water that are converging on a bend where the water gets sped up. So the fastest parts of rivers are usually on the bends, the outside bends. And our canoe was going sideways under the front of one of these containers. So the containers are actually angled so they make them more dynamic through the water. And the current was getting sucked down under these containers. So we both sprung into action and started paddling sideways, which was actually side onto one of these containers. And we nearly got sucked down under it. And then as we turned left just past one of these containers, a barge was heading straight for us, like head on. So I made a couple of maneuvers in the canoe, because I was in the rear, and we just got shot down the side of this container and the barge at breakneck speed, and then we shot out the back, and I turned the canoe, and the canoe just went into this little forested area, and the canoe came to a halt in this little forested sort of spot, and the water was filling up the canoe from the rain, and we were just sitting there, and the rain was just coming down, and we were like literally seconds or a meter from drowning at that point, because once you get sucked under these containers, if you imagine a Coke can in those crushing machines that get twisted and rotated, that big barges get sucked under these containers.